Hello, I'm Jonathan Carr-West. I'm Chief Executive of LGRU, and I'm delighted to welcome you here to this LGRU conversation. This is the latest in a series of discussions we're having about local government reorganisation. And we're talking to people who've been at the heart of some recent council shake-ups. Today, I'm delighted that we're joined by Graham Farrant, Chief Executive of Bournemouth, Christchurch and Poole Council. BCP Council was formed in 2019 in what was described at the time as the most complex piece of reorganisation in 40 years. I have a feeling it may lose that crown fairly soon, but certainly at the time was a really complicated piece of reorganisation, bringing together services from 4 separate councils. Graham's stepping down this year. He's set to retire after 47 years working in or for local government and indeed in the private sector, including 25 years as chief executive. So he's certainly done his time and earned a bit of a well-earned retirement. Graham, thanks for joining us today.
Jonathan, you right now.
I was just wondering, obviously we want to talk about local government reorganisation, but going right back, how did you end up in local government? How did you start there? What was your kind of way into the sector?
That was really interesting. I had a careers talk when I was about 15, and the careers talk was done by somebody who was a principal environmental health officer and described the job of an EHO. And I thought, actually, that sounds really interesting because it's got a scientific base. I came from a scientific background. A scientific base, but it's not just office-based or laboratory-based, it's multifaceted. And the role of the EHO seemed to be something that I was interested in. I wrote to all 33 London boroughs, every one of them, asking for a student placement, because at that point, local government was doing a lot of training, and eventually got a placement with Westminster City Council to be a student EHO with them on a 4-year sandwich course, doing a degree course at what was then Thames Poly, now the University of Greenwich, in environmental health. And that gave you the professional qualification to be an EHO. So working in one of the highest profile environmental health teams in the country in terms of food hygiene and standards, but also getting trained. And it turned out to be an absolutely excellent grounding, I think, an all-round grounding for a career in local government. So a very simple story of a careers talk that inspired me to go and do something.
Fantastic. A long road from there to BCP in 2019. What were some of the places you passed through on the way?
So I worked at Westminster for about 4 years, spent a 9-month, what was almost a rural retreat at Kensington and Chelsea as a team leader in my first promotion, and then went back to Westminster, went into housing, got involved in housing repairs and particularly minor repairs in asbestos. And things like that. And then went to Birmingham as assistant director at the age of 30. And in Birmingham, I was responsible for all the central services, including contract management for refuse collection, waste disposal, CHAR, admin, licensing, things like that. Took over the cemeteries and crematoria, took over a trading laboratory, got interested in regen, and then went to be chief exec of City Challenge and ran a regen devolution pilot project for the Aston ward. Picked up some SRB projects. I then became director of housing in Birmingham, so biggest social landlord in the country, 93,000 homes at the time, and was there till the year 2000, and then came down to Barking and Dagenham as chief exec. It's my first chief exec role in the year 2000, and that was a hugely valuable experience in a relatively small London borough, but a place that needed to shape its identity. So I did that for about 4.5 years, and then was given an opportunity to go to the private sector to run a private equity-backed leisure business. And you notice I've not mentioned leisure as being part of my career, but it was the opportunity to go and run sort of 35 leisure contracts across the country in the private sector, private equity-backed, some national sports centres, so Bisham Abbey, Lilleshall, Home Pierpont, the British Wheelchair Sports Foundation, and some private sector venues as well. So I took that opportunity, thoroughly enjoyed the experience of working in private equity industry because it's very focused on the numbers, very focused on performance. And we got top line growth. We achieved a huge increase in profitability. I tried to buy the business 3 times, couldn't get it away, then moved to a consultancy, which sort of did leisure and business consultancy. And then we hit the what was then called the credit crunch, I think, or a recession as we now know it, and then moved back into local government to run Thurrock, which was described to me then, Thurrock Council described as the 3rd worst council in the country. And they had an improvement board. It was really struggling with governance. I think I was the 6th chief exec in 5 years to run Thurrock. Bob Coomer had been in and done an interim job before me and had really set some strong standards. So I was able to work there for a couple of years, and then and really turning it around, I think we took over the Development Corporation. And then the chief exec of Barking and Dagenham left, and I had a conversation with the leader, and then I ran Thurrock and Barking and Dagenham. for a couple of years. That was, again, challenging. And then at the invitation of Bob Kerslake into the civil service to run the Her Majesty's Land Registry, which was, again, a really interesting experience, a turnaround of an organisation that was struggling with direction. Government had decided not to make a decision on whether to sell it or not, so it was in quite a difficult position. They then made that decision under Theresa May as Prime Minister. We set a new strategy and digitised a lot of the register. That was really quite exciting. And then BCP Council to do what was then the most complex bit of local government reorganisation for 40 years. 2 unitaries, a district and a part of a county all coming together.
So you arrived there in early 2019 with the explicit sort of brief. You knew you were going in to oversee that reorganisation.
Yes.
What was that like? What were the early days of that like?
It was fascinating because they'd done a lot of program management and project management. And the biggest lesson I learned from that I would feed on to anybody is program manage the hell out of it. We had 70 project or program managers making sure that decisions were taken and that we recorded them and we made sure they were implemented. But the problem for us was because of a judicial review taken by Christchurch Council. I was appointed in August, September to start on the 1st of January. The council was going to be set up on the 1st of April, but the elections to that council were then going to be held in May, 5 weeks later. So the shadow authority comprised of all the councillors that were on Bournemouth or Poole or Christchurch or that bit of Dorset County that covered it on those councils, they weren't the people that had the long-term interest in running the council. So we did that bit sort of back to front, and that meant that we couldn't really set the strategy, couldn't really make key budget decisions because those councillors were all saying, well, we might not be here. And at that time, the politics was moving quite rapidly, and what was expected to be a Conservative majority, the Conservatives got 36 out of 76, so just short of a majority. So all the other parties came together and said, well, we'll run the council then. So we unexpectedly, I think, moved into a no overall control Liberal Democrat-led alliance, the Three Towns Alliance. And they didn't, a number of the people that had campaigned against local government reorganisation found themselves on the council, running the council after local government reorganisation. So really interesting tensions. So that setup period was a real focus on safety. Make sure nobody falls through the cracks, make sure the services continue. And we had some real challenges in that. So just to describe one in particular, Dorset County Council moved their permanent children's services social workers out of the Christchurch area so that what we took over was a budget and some agency staff, but no permanent children's social workers for the Christchurch population. So every child in Christchurch that had any contact with social care had to move to a new social worker. We had to move to new policies because they had to adopt the Bournemouth or the Poole policies. So some real intricate difficulties of managing that on the ground, but we were absolutely clear, across the line safely.
And so you're managing that through a really intensive project management process.
Yes.
How do you as chief exec stay on top of that? You've got 70 different programs going on. What's your sort of management?
So I think a clear governance structure. So clear structure of which decisions are going to members of the council, which decisions are going to be taken by officers, and as they're taken, are they properly recorded? Are they then being implemented? And that follow through is something that we don't always do particularly well in local government, I think. So having made a decision, make sure it gets implemented. But also, given the fact that we were merging 3 versions of every single service, we had to decide for how long would we carry on doing 3 different service levels and how quickly could we get them into a single policy and single service standard. And I use this phrase as sort of top, middle or bottom because when you looked at the 3 councils, either for county level services, if you like, Poole was a unitary, Bournemouth was a unitary or Dorset County, or for district level services, Poole or Bournemouth or Christchurch, we would have some which people would judge, well, this is a better service than those, but we couldn't afford to go to the best of everything. So we had to start making decisions about where are you going to set the bar. And that meant that in some circumstances, on some services, one or more of those councils saw a deterioration, as they would see it, in the policy or in the service standard, because we simply could not afford to push everybody to the top standard.
One of the things we've heard in previous conversations with people who've been through this process is and you sort of reflected there, is that you're really clear decision making about what are the things that you need to have aligned on day one, and what are the things that maybe you can say, okay, in an ideal world we'd have brought all that in line and would have, but actually we don't need to do that on day one.
Yeah.
We can come back to that. And I guess when I hear people say that, that absolutely makes sense. But I always wondered, well, that's easy to say in hindsight, but how do you make that decision
Yes.
as you run towards vesting day about, what are the things that we absolutely have to have nailed down to be safe and legal, and what are the things that we can say, okay, look, maybe there are some, maybe people in that team will have different contracts, but we can sort that out over time, or whatever it is. How do you make those decisions?
It is really difficult, sort of balancing of priorities, and I guess the key thing for us was because we didn't have that. So most councils will elect their council effectively in the May and then come into being the following April. So you've got those 11 months as a shadow authority to agree what your strategic priorities are and to agree what your budget parameters are and how you might move that. We didn't have that time. So actually what we had to say effectively was it's okay to carry on providing 3 different levels of service on day one. Okay. It's a question then of what's the priority and which ones need to be done first. And that was the judgment we were making. If I was to be critical of our judgment, the issue about terms and conditions of the workforce, we have literally just 6.5 years into the process, got agreement on a single set of terms and conditions for the entire workforce. Partly that was because it's really complicated, partly because the administration at the time decided to delay it for 1.5 years because it was going to cost more money and that we couldn't, take it out the budget proposal, just push it back. Partly because the complexity of doing it means that it just takes a long time. And what I've come to realise is every single job we talk about across the council, let's take my original job as an environmental health officer, you will find a different job description, you will find slightly different job parameters, and you will find a different grading structure and different overtime rates, call out rates, bank holiday working conditions. All of those things are all different, and you have to harmonise those when you can. But from day one, we had 3 different sets of environmental health officers on 3 different terms and conditions doing the same job, and that's an equal pay risk. I'd have been more comfortable at about 3, and it'd be much more comfortable if we'd had it during the 11 months and we'd mapped it all out and done most of it before we started.
So I'm interested in that timing. Obviously, you had a particular set of circumstances. You had the judicial review, you had the shadow authority with all of the previous councillors coming through. So a lot more happened sort of post vesting day than you applied. And as you say, you didn't have that period. Everything had to happen a lot quicker. When you look back, do you think that was to what extent was that a blessing in disguise? That actually there was a sort of speed to the process that meant you had to kind of program manage through and push through?
I think, the pressures that it added was in a sense was quite helpful because we had to say, right, we've got to take these decisions now. So we need a strategy. Let's get a strategy in place quickly. You couldn't spend 2 years to consult on it widely and digest it and do all that. Actually, we needed a strategy, and we needed that within the first 6 or 7 months. We needed a budget plan because as soon as we had the council in, we were looking at the following year's budget, and that had some significant savings in. So yes, there was some benefits from it. The problem was just the pressure. So on day one, effectively, we had me and I think we appointed the corporate directors sort of around vesting day. Everybody else just came across doing what they were currently doing. And actually one of the problems for us was that on vesting day, everybody else wasn't really invested in BCP Council. They came from their preceding councils and they were still doing what they used to do in the areas they used to do it. So they didn't see a difference. And of course, it doesn't help if you have no councillors on vesting day because they've all gone into their pre-election period.
Right. So all of that makes it harder to build that corporate culture, team, to build that corporate identity. Well, we'll come back perhaps to talk about how that maps or doesn't map onto place identity. But you go through all of this, and I guess one of the things that I think is really interesting about the timing of the BCP story is, perhaps people are in a bit of a place and I think, well, we're just going to get through this and then everything will calm down. And of course, you do all of this, and the next thing you know, there's a pandemic, being crisis, and then there's and the world didn't stand still as you kind of carefully put together a council. How did you, what as chief exec in that, as someone trying to lead an organisation through kind of the reorganisation, through the kind of period of trying to becoming a new organisation, but also all these external shocks. What was your sort of guiding philosophy for decision making in those circumstances?
I think just try and have a clear sense of direction, a very clear culture. So we set our values quite early, and integrity was part of that, and making sure that we really ensured that the whole council was on board with the culture. As you say, sort of 9 months in, suddenly the whole world changed. I mean, I remember the debate with civil servants in March 2020 saying there's no way we could put this country into lockdown. It might work in China, it would not work here. And by the end of March, wasn't it, we were in lockdown. And that was incredible. And, bearing in mind, if hopefully you can see the backdrop behind me, but Bournemouth, Christchurch, Poole is a beautiful place. It's a place that attracts loads of visitors. And that summer, it attracted many, many more visitors than we normally get. And behaviours were appalling.
And many viewers will remember those news stories about people piling down to the beaches.
So, as I always put it, the restaurants were shut, the pubs were shut, the off licence was open, the beach was open, the mercury hit the late 20s and early 30s centigrade. And so people came down here, and that's when you discover the difficulty of trying to implement change. Things like tow away. So we just, parking behaviours. I discovered the phrase of fly parking. It's a bit like fly tipping, really. You drive along, you see a double yellow line, so you park on it. Because the fines, now we've just got permission to do a pilot of higher fines. And so I said, well, that's fine, just tow them away. And they said, we've never done tow away, Graham. We don't have any contracts. We don't have any signage. We can't tow them away. Why not? Well, we've never needed it before.
Yeah.
So
I remember there was a whole behavioural economics thing on that, wasn't there? People would come down, fly parking, great decision. Say, well, there's an 80 quid fine. Fine. I'm happy to pay. We just see it as, well, I'm paying £80 or whatever to be by the beach today. I'm happy to do that.
And of course, in fact, you pay it within 14 days. It's actually only £35 to park on W line, which is the price. We're charging £22 for a day's parking, and it's £35 to park on a W line, even closer to the beach. So that was a real sort of traumatic time. And of course, what my teams were doing, like every local authority up and down the country, was some fantastic efforts in getting volunteers together, looking after people that were vulnerable, and making sure we were providing all the information that government needed, and doing all that locally, whilst our population hugely increased, because what percentage of the country were on furlough, being paid 80% of their salary to come down to join us on a sunny day. So there were some real challenges there, and I think strategic leadership was important. And interestingly, we engaged the leader in our daily emergency planning updates, and the leader was very heavily engaged in a direct way, which was very helpful. But only 9 months after that, we hit a change of control.
I was going to ask about that, and it hasn't stopped there, right? There's been quite a lot of, is it 5 leaders in 5 years?
5 leaders, yes.
Political groups. How do you manage that?
It's complex. So what you have to do, I think, is be really clear about the overall strategy, be really clear about the culture and the integrity that you want. And we've had some challenging times during that. One challenge which resulted in the flexible use of capital receipts rules being rewritten for the whole of local government as a result of what we were doing. So we have had some interesting challenges. You've just got to be clear about the direction, be clear about your lines of integrity, and then work with the politicians as that changes. And we went Unity Alliance, Conservative Minority, Conservative Majority, Conservative Minority, now 3 Towns Alliance. As you say, 5 leaders, 2 of whom have been Councillor Vicky Slade, who is now an MP. We've had I think 2 councillors actually had 5 different political configurations in their first 4 years. So, elected as Poole People Party, went independent, joined the Conservatives, went independent, joined Poole Engage, lost a seat. That was in a 4-year period. Managing that, trying to keep an eye on that, you've just got to have your wits about you. Your political antennae need to be really strong. And I suppose the phrase that I've used for every new appointment is BCP Council is not for the faint-hearted. It's really rewarding. It's really engaging. It's a fantastic place to be, but it's not for the faint-hearted because the politics is so complex.
And what's the relationship between that? I mean, maybe this is an impossible question, but there's lots of play. Politics has become more complicated everywhere.
Yes.
But to what extent are the complexities of the politics in BCP a legacy or a sort of still the ongoing ripple of that bringing together of lots of very different councils that saw themselves quite differently?
There is still quite a bit of that because there's an issue that I think is worth flagging about the name. Now, nobody could agree on a common name, so we went for Bournemouth, Christchurch and Poole Council, which constantly reminds people that there's Bournemouth and there's Christchurch and there's Poole. And I compare that to my time in Barking and Dagenham, which was very clearly Barking and Dagenham. And actually the London Borough of Newham, which brought together East Ham and West Ham and Stratford, it became more colloquially known as Newham. Thurrock, Grays and Purfleet and South Ockenden, but known as Thurrock. So I think there's something about nomenclature that just reminds everybody every day that we are three towns. Now, our three towns alliance leadership, major on that really. They want to respect the towns. The original plan and the case for change for local government reorganisation was focused on this becoming Britain's newest city by the sea, and it was really focusing on the conurbation. So what we have to do, I think, is blend the messaging between the local. Nobody is ever going to say, "I live in BCP." Because they're going to live in Poole, or they're going to live in Christchurch, or they're going to live in Broadstone, or wherever within the area. So locally, we have to make sure we respect the integrity and the value of the towns and the 19 high streets. But when we're looking regionally and nationally, I've got to articulate the case for a conurbation of 400,000 people in a tightly packed urban area, which has got some fantastic environmental credentials, but it is a single place and it is a conurbation. But I don't call it a city because that goes back to the old messaging.
Yeah, that's a really interesting balancing act to maintain, isn't it? I think that's really useful. I'm sure there'll be lots of people. I think there are lots of, as we see reorganisation happening across two-tier local government in England, I think a lot of people will find that quite an important sort of thing that you have. How do you retain? Because that is exactly the kind of issue that a lot of people grapple. How do you retain individual identity of the places that people think they live and identify within a new corporate identity?
Yeah, and the conversation we're having at the moment, we're out to consultation on a community governance review, is should we set up parish councils? Now, the danger with that conversation is what people mean when they think of the parish council is, can we have the old Poole Council back? But actually, Poole itself is made up of a number of places, whether it's Broadstone, Parkstone, Poole, Sandbanks, Lilliput, which might, in a traditional parish council sense, might consider themselves to be standalone areas. Christchurch already had two parish councils, and just before LGR established another two. So Christchurch is fully parished. In the intervening 5 years, a small part of Bournemouth has come forward with a parish council. But in Bournemouth and Poole, we're having that debate at the moment. Whilst we're also having a debate about devolution to a regional footprint, the Wessex footprint. So, it's quite difficult. So we're talking about Wessex and the potential for a regional footprint. We've got BCP as a conurbation and the 19 high streets and 3 towns within that. And then we've got the potential to go even lower in terms of parish councils or town councils. And that's quite a complex mix.
It is. And one of the things I think is very interesting in your part of the world is that proposed or potential now strategic authority, the fact that it is being labelled as Wessex, which again does have certain sort of identity, that's not a new word. That's, whether it's Thomas Hardy or ancient Anglo-Saxon kingdom, that does have a sort of meaning and draw on a set of connotations in and of itself.
Yes. And of course, I often get faced with the fact that Bournemouth and Christchurch were both in Hampshire until 1974 reorganisation. So, they're not really part of Dorset. They look east, do they? Poole, in fact, I think at one time, was the county town of Dorset. But Poole has always looked west. So bringing this conurbation and then giving it either an eastward-facing or a westward-facing configuration was quite a difficult debate for our councillors. But actually they approached it. We had a really good council meeting talking about should we go with Wessex or should we go with Hampshire? And the majority decision then was to go with Wessex. But, we've closed the cremator, the crematorium in Poole. So we've still got the crematorium open because we use it as a chapel, but we don't cremate bodies in Poole. We move them across on a vehicle into Bournemouth, cremate them in Bournemouth and bring the ashes back. Because we have spare capacity in the Bournemouth crematorium and the Poole cremators were past their sell-by date. And some people have said to me, but Graham, we don't want to be cremated in Hampshire. Because that's how they still see Bournemouth 50 years after that LGR.
That's what we can take from that, which may or may not be a comfort to people going through this at the moment, is that it's never simple and it's never over. These things have long.
That's true.
But so Graham, you announced this year you're going to step down, you're going to retire after I don't want to make you feel old, but 47 years.
Unbelievable, isn't it? Unbelievable.
Yeah. What are, it's that's such a long career. There's an unfair question, and you've spoken to some of this already, but if you had to distill just a few kind of key leadership lessons from that. I'm interested whether you were a chief exec, then you went into the private sector, then you came back, and you went into the civil service, then you came back. So really rich sort of set of experiences. What would be your kind of key leadership lessons from all of that?
I don't know. I mean, in terms of career lessons, I always say to people, do what you enjoy what you do, because there's nothing worse than somebody who doesn't enjoy their job and having them as a colleague. And I think as an individual level, we all need to find out what is it that we enjoy doing, and can I spend my time doing that? Can I spend more of my time? So that's one, sort of similar. In terms of leadership, I think it's be true to yourself, be honest, know where your lines of integrity are, and don't cross them. And then be really clear about what you want to do in your role and what you want to achieve. So it's one of those interesting things, isn't it? My career plan at the beginning was to try and be a principal environmental health officer somewhere like Oxford, so I could live in the country, work in the city. Where I've got the biggest reward, I think, out of helping to shape a place and seeing that place change and seeing an organisation change and helping to adopt an open and engaging culture. I've got huge rewards out of seeing people who were struggling in their job and helping them to find what they were really good at and doing it. And I've got, lots of stories where people have been struggling. We've talked it through. We've, in some cases, put them down to a job that they've realised that that's what they enjoyed doing before they got promoted. So, the Peter Principle says that you'll get promoted to your level of incompetence. Well, if that happens, let's help people get back to their level of maximum competence.
That's right.
So I've done some examples of that, and it's just some of it is so rewarding. Monday this week, I went to the graduation for our supported interns. There are people that have had education, health and care plans. They've got disabilities. They're really struggling to get into employment. We give them an internship for a year. They might be working in our arcade, filling the stock, doing the cleaning, checking the people that are coming through or whatever it is. They might be working our reception. What they all say is at the end of their year, they would not have been able to get on a bus to get to work before they started their internship. And to go to their graduation and see them coming out, that's so rewarding. So some of this role and leadership can be immensely rewarding. Find out what it is that you enjoy doing and just do it.
And that focus on people, places and people. So you're stepping down, I'm sure, because whenever I speak to sort of chief execs who are stepping down, they always end up doing like bits and bits. I'm sure you won't be lost to the sector entirely. But we're at a funny moment, aren't we? So there's a massive change. We've got the devolution and community empowerment bill has just been published. We're seeing if government achieves what it wants to achieve, we will have no more districts and counties. The process you've been through will happen everywhere. Single layer of unitary government. We'll have new mayoral strategic authorities. So there's a lot happening. So big changes. The government's still consulting on looking at a national care service. Still, we know from our research, still have massive financial challenges within the sector as we cope with ever rising demand in adults and children's services. My sense is that most people who work in local government, certainly at a senior level, are sort of by definition professional optimists. They would do. But I was just wondering, as you sort of reflect on the future direction of local government, what are the things that concern you? And I think more importantly, what are the things that keep you optimistic?
Well, let's go with the optimistic first. Government needs local government. You cannot manage everything from the centre. There are some areas of expertise that you can, and I'd cite my example in land registry. Actually, a single national land registry is valuable. We're taking local searches and putting those into the centralised system. All that's fine. But you cannot manage the sorts of services that we provide centrally. So government needs us. So let's be optimistic about that. Local people need us because we deliver local services, and the thing I like about this job, we change people's lives every day. Sometimes for the better. We provide them with services or we improve their environment. Sometimes we take their children from them or prosecute them, but we change people's lives with most of the things we do. So I think that local influence on all those services is key. Local decision making is generally better than centralised decision making for everything that has sort of nuance or flexibility within it. So And the role of councillors, I think, is absolutely vital. I sometimes feel sorry for councillors because they get elected in a ward to represent the ward. On day one, we ask them to start making difficult decisions about the whole area. And then we ask them to make difficult decisions about services that they're not really interested in, because they come in for one thing and they find themselves making decisions about, I don't know, education or social care, which might not have been the things they came for. And then we also ask them to represent the whole area in some national or regional discussions. And I think for councillors, it's about finding out what they are most interested in and where they help us. But I actually think the role of councillors is invaluable, and therefore we need to support that. I think that, it's a mixture in optimism and pessimism. Finance, the services that we've had to stop doing mostly have left a gap in our communities. And the question is, who's going to step in to fill those gaps? Is it going to be a community organisation? Is it going to be a group of individuals? Or actually, we're just going to let that service wither? And now, personally, I would modernise a lot of our services like libraries. I would give us much more flexibility to change the library's estate and focus that in a different way. I would give us more flexibility. Government's trying to impose rules, isn't it? And the work on waste collection, for example, trying to standardise waste collection, and it really depends on what your disposal contracts are. And what's available. I remember I lived just outside Bishop Stortford, where we had a green bin service, which allowed you to put food waste in. So you could put domestic food wrapped in newspaper into your green bin service, because the facility it went to had a license for composting food material as well as other organic material. We don't have that sort of supplier in Poole, so we can't offer that service. So there needs to be some flexibility within that.
Otherwise, you end up with lowest common denominator.
Yes, absolutely. In terms of pessimism, it's primarily around finance. I do think the politics has got more challenging, and if BCP is an example of what might happen, then actually decision making in no overall control councils is more difficult. It is slower because there are more parties and more people to be involved in those decisions. I suppose some people could argue that leads to better decision making because it's consulted on more widely, but it can definitely be slower. The other issue for me is just the reputation of local government. I've certainly seen more political touchiness. It is a difficult role. More people want to come into it as they see that sort of difficulty being exposed more and more. And that's the issue, isn't it? We will have to attract 16 and 17-year-olds like I was so many years ago that says, yeah, that's the job I want to do. I want to come in and do that.
Which means we need to be clear both about the public service benefits, but also about that it is a good career path and that it will give you a good life, and that Well, look, I mean, obviously at LGIU we firmly agree with all of that. I mean, we agree that particularly that decisions are best made locally, and that councillors who, let's face it, often get a tough time, and people are very cynical about politics, but we know that councillors around the country do an amazing job for very little recognition, and the whole system depends on them. So that's an important point that we need to keep.
If you ever read, as I do, read the comments on the local newspapers that are now all online, the comments about councillors, people generally just have no clue about what councillors do and how many hours they give to their community and the benefits that brings when they're criticising them for whatever it is today.
And we know that from the polling we do, that people overwhelmingly recognise how important the council is and think it makes a bigger difference to their life than any other institution. But they don't know what councillors do. They don't know how decisions are made. And partly that's why we run the Councillor Awards every year, to shine a bit of light on that. Graham, thank you so much for your time today. I know that people are going to find this really inspiring and practical, and we know that these conversations have a sort of eager audience amongst sort of senior officers and chief execs, and indeed councillors who are putting together proposals around reorganisation as we speak, and are just sort of desperate to sort of see guidance and thinking about how it's actually going to work. So that's hugely useful. If you are one of those people, if you want more of our latest resources on local government reorganisation, do click the link below or visit lgiu.org. But for now, Graham Farrant, Chief Executive of BCP Council, thank you again.
Thank you, Jonathan. Thanks very much.